My name is Heather Flower, and I'm most commonly known for my work on Genderect, which is a visual novel about talking, fighting, and making out with monsters, and Extreme Meat Punks Forever, the first season of which came out in 2018, and the second season of which hopefully is going to come out this year.
Gotcha. So sorry to ask you to repeat something. You just sort of cut out when you gave just a bit of biographical information. Can you just say where you're based out of and your age again?
I'm 23 years old and I don't give out my location.
No worries. Thank you. I guess like a good place to start is, like what feeling do you get out of making games?
I think it depends on the day. I think on the best days, it feels almost like magic. Like, when things come together on a really good day, it feels like my job is to create entire universes,
Mm-hmm.
Like watching things just burst out of the air and suddenly there's an entire world to explore. And I'm only partly in control on the best days. It's more like a conversation between me and the computer than anything else. And on the worst days, it's also a conversation, but both of us are yelling.
So, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting and weird because I think often, for people who make games, there's a way they think about the games they make, and then there's a way that people who play your games think, talk, and write about, these conversations that you're having. I mean, is there, and maybe it's too personal, or maybe you don't really care. I mean, are there ways that you feel like the ways that people commonly interpret your work, isn't even in the ballpark of where you're at? Are there things that you think people tend to misunderstand, or are you the sort of creator who doesn't mind and would rather not comment on that sort of thing?
One of the very fun things about being in my specific situation is a lot of the games that I make come very directly out of the, grim miasma of my brain. I have some weird shit going on in there, and I tend to, get it out via art, which I think is something that a lot of people do. But the thing is, a lot of very smart people follow me, and a lot of very smart people, interpret my work. And their idea of my work is so much better than my own.
I feel like that's that's been my experience as well, and I feel like, in your role or in mine, part of the quote unquote job, even though it is a real job, is to kind of be quiet, take credit for that, and just sort of act like you did it on purpose.
Yeah. A person on Mastodon, let me pull up their username because they deserve to be credited for this. They have a really, really cool... they have this really, really cool theory that all of Meat Punks is actually a retelling of the Book of Exodus.
Uh-huh.
Not intentional at all, but I'm so into it. It's gatitb at icosahedron.website on Mastodon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you read Exodus?
Cool fucking theory.
Yeah. Have you read it?
Have I read the Bible?
Yeah. That's not where I was expecting to start this conversation either.
Yeah. I mean, I was raised pretty dang Christian growing up, so I've definitely read bits and pieces of the Bible. I'm not sure, I don't think I've ever gone all the way through with any of the books, but, I could probably give you strong references for pretty big chunks of it.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it's interesting because, I don't know, we don't have to go down that whole side pocket of games criticism and other people interpreting your work, because I'm really more interested to hear about your relationship with it. So I guess to sort of put it in a different direction rather than to dig down into the Bible first thing in the morning with you, I guess zooming out, are there things you've learned in these conversations or sometimes arguments with your computer making games that have wound up sort of being life lessons, things you've either learned about yourself or the way you treat others through, making these I guess, like, for lack of a better term, like digital goods?
Yeah, interesting. That's a really interesting question. My first instinct, and I might go back on this at a later point. I'm like still mulling the question over, but my first instinct is that I don't think I have learned anything. Yeah. Like, not life lessons or anything. Like, when I'm writing, or like when I'm making art, I'm taking from life and I'm putting it into a piece of art. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm distilling life into art. And I don't really feel like I learn much from that, because it's primarily, when I'm doing that stuff, it's a conversation between me and myself. And the computer may act as an external force, but I don't think it counts as a person. I can't say, like, oh, I learned to be nice because my computer is somebody that I am nice to, you know?
Right. No, and I don't know if it is the thing where you necessarily need to, but it's I don't know. It's something that I'm curious about, because I feel like often, I mean, this kind of ties into another question I want to ask, which is just sort of like, when you've finished making a game, why make another one? Like why go through that process again, and why specifically a game over, say, like, writing a poem or writing a novel? Because I think, like, just to tie it to the bigger thing, like, I feel like my sense is in what we kind of nebulously refer to as games culture, or game audiences, or pockets of both, where the feeling is like there's just a bottomless supply of games, and they just keep pumping out like they're a renewable resource. But there's a person or many people behind them who are deciding to spend their time doing that. I mean, is there a reason why, after you've made a game, you want to make more, or you have made others, or is it not really the way you think of it?
Yeah. Yeah, these are really good questions, by the way. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are two things that kind of keep me going. The first is, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have art, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have the capacity to create, to express what's going on inside my weird, fucked up head to other people. Mm-hmm. And I primarily choose video games for that, because it's what I'm good at. They're what makes sense to me. I do some writing on the side as well. I write short stories, but that's not really where my head's at all the time, Like, my brain doesn't work for short stories in the way that it does for video games. Like, right. When I'm making a game, it's like I can connect 20 different things all over the place and tie them all together into a single concrete narrative. And when it works, I think it's one of the best feelings on the planet for me. But it's difficult for me to do that in other works of, like, other media as well.
Right. Well, I don't know. I'm always sort of torn on reading people's quotes back to them from other things. But you said in an interview last year, and this is when the world was in a different bad place, or overlapping different bad place. But you said that last year, my worldview is essentially this: the world is in a very bad place right now. ... It's very easy to feel hopeless, but we can never stop fighting for what is right. And I don't know if it seems absurd to connect that quote to games or making games, but I do wonder, are there ways you think games can fight for what's right, or remind people of what's right, that other mediums cannot?
Yeah, the thing that sticks to me with that question is what other mediums cannot.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything that games can do that other mediums can't. I think whatever a game can make you feel, a poem can make you feel the same way if it's a good enough poem. Or a painting can make you feel the same way. Or a movie. I don't think of games as unique as a medium. I think they exist in the broader continuum of art.
Yeah.
And I do feel like they serve a purpose in like engaging a certain audience and delivering certain messages, but I don't think there is anything specifically unique about them that another work of art in another medium couldn't do just as well, if not better, honestly.
Yeah.
A lot of the times, like, if you look at my itch page, there is frankly an absurd number of games there. I think it's like 30 or 40 now that are like just visually available.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I make a lot of games, and a lot of them are just me trying to make other people feel less alone, if that makes sense. Like, I want to make art that gives people self-recognition, that allows them to say, oh yeah, I am dealing with something like Casses in Meat Punks, or I feel alone like Jess in Secret Spaces, or I am also killing God like Jay in God Killer Brigade 10 Trillion. I don't know. That's a lot of my MO for this stuff. Obviously I want to encourage people to action. I want to encourage people to fight for what's good. That's part of why I started making Meat Punks in the first place. It's basically agitprop for a new generation. And I gladly hold that label, and I gladly try to push people in that direction. But I feel like playing a game isn't doing an action. It's not affecting something out in the world. And I think that's kind of something that we forget sometimes.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it might be worth kind of elaborating on who the we is there, because maybe it's true of you and me here, but I feel like there is a deep recognition of that, and a deep insecurity of that, and also a deep denial of that. But it gets so nebulous because it's like, all right, well, let's say I'm connecting a dot to game culture, then like, well, who am I really talking about, and what am I really talking about there? Like, I feel like I'm not sure what the question is there, but I feel like there's a thing where, like, I think we've blurred the lines where, because it's an interactive thing, we feel like it's us actually doing something on a greater cosmic plane, as opposed to. But at the same time, like, I don't want to minimize it either, but there's definitely a line where it is just a distraction, but it's also like it's a distraction that can be meaningful. So I guess, like, when you say, like, we sometimes forget that, is there a we you have in mind, or were you just literally talking about us?
It was the general we.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Were you talking about the Nintendo Wii? That's another option here.
Yeah, exactly. That was what I was talking about. That thing did not have a lot of memory. It forgets things constantly.
Right.
Yeah, but that's an interesting point. Like, there definitely are times in which, like, a game has affected somebody. Like, if you look at, let's say, MMOs, like, people coming together, making friendships, not always the best friendships, but, like, friendships that can last a very long time because, like, they have the continued space together. Like, that is doing something. That's connecting people. Or when somebody builds something in Minecraft, let's say, and then posts a screenshot of that, then that's interacting with other people, and that's, like, it might inspire some of them. It might bring something forward in others. I think the moment at which a game starts affecting things in the outside world, in which your playing of a game affects things. By the way, I'm sorry if you hear weird noises in the background. We got a kitten like a week ago, and she's still exploring the apartment all over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the kitten, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. She's adorable. What was I saying? Right. I think it becomes an action that affects other people when it starts affecting other people. You know?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I think, like, maybe you're getting a sense of just from these questions so far, like, I feel like there's just so much in the space between us all in this space that I don't know, like either there are like basic things that are not being articulated, or it's hard to tell if they're being taken for granted, or I guess just for me, in this context, it's like, am I the only person who wonders about this sort of stuff? Do other people think about this too? And I don't really think that it's just me, but it's just, to me, it's interesting to hear about it. And I don't know, because like, none of this stuff exists in a vacuum, and I don't really know that there's like a good, smooth, clear way to connect this with some of the stuff you were talking about when we were emailing about sort of like wounds created by capitalism and decisions made by game companies made in the 80s and 90s, where we're still feeling the effects of that today. And you mentioned that there's positive aspects of healing from these wounds by decisions made decades ago. So I don't really know like the best way to connect that with what we were just talking about, but I would be interested to hear you talk a little bit about like these wounds, from a couple decades ago, 80s and 90s, and like what is the silver lining of us still dealing and healing with those wounds today?
Yeah. Geez. Yeah, dang. I set that at 1 a.m. What was I talking about? I'm looking through it now.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, this cat is trying to climb all fucking over me right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot. Sorry about that. I think a lot of the problems with gamer culture comes from capitalism in the 80s and 90s. Companies were incentivized to make captive audiences by turning their marketing more and more toxic, focusing more and more on domination and masculinity, not that the two go together by default, and locking in an audience via the nerd culture mechanism, which is essentially turning consumption into identity, bringing people together based on that shared identity, and then encouraging them to turn on each other in a battle for dominance in the area of who has consumed more media.
Right.
It creates this thing where the best way to gain status in your group is to consume more. It turns watching a movie into this battle for domination. There are positive aspects of video games culture as well. One may, for instance, look at the newest itch.io bundle, which has raised, I believe, $3 million in the past few days for the NAACP and the Community Bail Fund. So, like, there are good aspects as well, but I do wonder, on a basic level, if video games have been bad for us as a society. Which is a very funny thing for me to say as a person who fucking makes video games for a living.
Well, gosh, I mean, my dad used to always say, oh, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. So I think there's a way you can operate in the space, try not to be complicit in the bad things, and try actively to, be some of the sunlight that acts as a disinfectant. So on the other hand too, like I feel like this is a thing where it's like, well, okay, I don't know if games are a net positive or a net negative, but maybe they can be better if we like really look at ourselves in the mirror, because that's like the only way to figure out like, all right, well, who do we want to be instead? So like so my question before was like, okay, so there are those negatives, which I think are known, and I don't think are controversial even anymore to assert, but like, is there, I mean, you mentioned like there was an upshot of like us healing from those wounds. So I don't know if like, for example, that bundle, which is like covering it nearly 3 million right now, like, is that in some way a silver lining or are there other positive things you're thinking of as far as like us just dealing with the trauma of the past?
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem comes from thinking of video games as a monolith, right?
Yes.
Like, it's so many different cultures and subcultures.
I was going to say, just like, thank you for mentioning that, because I feel like that's a thing very rarely articulated, is like, even if you say capital V video games, it's still not a monolith.
Yeah. Like, I can say that all of video games is a net negative or a net positive or whatever, but I don't think that really matters. I mean, it matters, of course, but it's not a productive line of thinking, because what are you going to do? End all video games? So, like, I think there are positive communities and there are negative communities, and neither is fully positive or fully negative. There's always a silver lining and there's always shitty parts.
Right.
But I don't know. When you look at what kinds of video games are dominating the current sphere, like where the culture is right now, not so much the positive stuff, I think. Can
you unpack that just a little? I mean, just like I'm with you, but I want to make sure that I'm not. Well, I don't know. Just because I think we can say that, but it's like it's useful to connect the dots and make sure we're drawing the same conclusion and doing the same math, getting there.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at AAA games right now, oftentimes you find like, okay, here's a game with a couple cool mechanics, and also it's about fucking enjoying killing brown people in the Middle East. It's like, this is a game about doing colonialism. This is a game about doing capitalism. And it's like, it's just reproducing these same destructive systems, but you get to imagine that you're the one destroying for one.
Right.
You know?
Mm-hmm. You know, when I talk Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so much of AAA games are about domination, about being always the one on top, about like the struggle for power. And I feel like by encouraging that culture about always like winning in the end, about always being the one to kick ass and take names, not necessarily that these are wrong ideals. I mean, like, I think there are purposes to all of these. Like, I am very much a person who is for violence in video games, honestly. Like, I feel like violence is a morally neutral tool, and depending on how you use it, you can do good or do evil. But, like, when you have this persistent culture of domination, of always being the one on top, it encourages you to see systems of domination in the real world as being morally right. Because if this were a video game and you were playing it, you would be the one on top. Mm-hmm. But that's not how it works, especially, like, not for people outside of America.
You know, it always struck me as weird that inherent and deep in the DNA of video games is this thing you're describing, and also this thing of striving to be the best, striving, you know, probably to be better than other people. And yet when, like, you finger point to anything that's sort of systemically wrong, weird, backwards, regressive, that interest in being the best doesn't extend to that. And I don't know if this is where some of that defensiveness, insecurity stuff I was talking about picks up, but there's just such a huge disconnect where the flaw is in you for pointing it out rather than the flaw being in, well, let's take this thing in the spirit of a game and let's apply it to reality. Like, instead, that sort of thing is often met with, I don't know, it's taken on this whole other new darker character in the last 5+ years, but it's gotten, you know, deeply antagonistic, and I'll just circle back to that word weird, and I don't know why that is, because I think, like, you zoom back out to, like, mainstream perceptions of video games, and yeah, I don't know. I don't really know if there's a question in there other than that's a thing that, like, I feel, and it's like, well, what do you do about that? Do you just sort of, you know, do you just go to, you know, your own smaller community and you try to make piece with things there, or do you like? Is this even a thing that like how do you? Because I think how I mean it's the same for all systemic things where it's hard to talk about, it's hard to think about, and much less like how do you solve something like that. So I guess these are ripples of the things you were talking about from games in the 80s and 90s. But yeah, I don't know what the question is in there. I'm sorry.
It's given me plenty to think about. Something that I am thinking about, I have a couple things actually.
Yeah.
You know about the sword of Damocles, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Something that I think about a lot is that basically everybody in game development has the sword of Damocles over their head. And the more popular they get, the bigger the sword gets. Because we have this toxic gaming culture that is persistently raging under the surface. If your game becomes liked by them, it can just as easily become hated by them. The second that you do something that they don't like.
Right.
And first off, that's bad.
Yeah. Right.
But
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. More specifically, I was just going to say, like, that is something that I feel like a lot of game developers don't talk about because talking about it tends to invite it.
Right. Well, so who's holding the sword?
Gamers.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought.
Yeah, and as soon as they decide to turn on you, that sword falls, and suddenly you're dealing with a massive harassment campaign. Like, hell, I am not exactly the most financially successful game developer in the world, and I still have had my fair share of, honestly, a minor amount of harassment considering, but still enough to be notable.
Right.
Like,
well, any amount, however small, is horrible.
Yeah.
Is horrible and poisonous.
Yeah, and like being marginalized only increases the danger that the sword is going to fall at any point. If you're trans, if you're a person of color, if you're disabled, any number of things can increase their chances of turning on you just for being a person who exists.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I had this question here, and it does connect, and I think this is a thing really, too, in the... I don't know. I guess, like, the question is, like, you know, how does, or just flat out does, the way larger game companies, like, engage with their audiences and communities over stuff like this? Like, how does that seem to impact expectations on or with independent developers? Like, is there a way where the broader industry, and I guess we're talking about like a very small cluster of companies, like is the way that they deal with this stuff, does it set the tone and expectation for how to hold that sword over you, or how you're supposed to react to that sword?
I don't think anybody has control.
Yeah.
I think some people egg on the fire. I think some people profit from it. Definitely.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of games companies acknowledge the fact that their audience is toxic or like internally acknowledge that their audience is toxic, but can't actually do anything about it. So why rock the boat, right?
Yeah.
If you know you're just going to get harassed. If people are just going to single out 3 or 4 members of your group as quote unquote the bad ones and harass them until they either get fired or quit.
Right.
This is a cycle that I've seen a few times. And like, obviously I'm not the expert on AAA game studios. My work in that sphere has been very limited.
Yeah.
Primarily because I'm just an indie dev.
Right.
But like, I have friends in that sphere, and from what I've heard from them, there is kind of that fear.
Yeah, I mean, something that I never really know what to say when people ask, like, oh, what have you learned doing all these interviews over the years? And something that, fortunately, I know I've learned and know I can talk about is just being able to articulate that, and again, this is another thing that's not a monolith, but, like, the game industry sort of is afraid of the audience it has created, and what can you do to control it? And that does seem to be, even though I think like there has been a way there's been a little bit more openness about that. There does seem to be, the party line is like, well, let's just not talk about it because we don't want to attract attention to it, and we definitely don't want to reward that sort of behavior. Again, I don't really know what the question is in there, but that's a thing that like I've definitely noticed and have definitely sensed, but I don't think you'll ever really see people like talking about openly, from whatever big game company. And I feel like, moderation can really only do so much to stamp out toxicity in game communities. And so I'm not asking you how do we solve it, but I wonder like what are solutions that like we're missing here, or like what's missing in the overall equation to sort of lock horns with it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time we sort of default to the nuclear waste disposal system for avoiding toxicity,
right.
Which is we leave it be, we don't touch it, we stay away from it as long as possible, and hopefully in 10 or 20 years, it's a little bit better.
Well, that's what professionals do with actual toxic waste, right? Is just sort of leave it alone.
Yeah.
Just leave it alone.
Yeah, well, it's more like 10,000 years, but yeah.
It'll be fine. Actually, we're getting in its way.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a better solution. I'm not a community moderator by trade. It is definitely something that I think a lot about just because it's self-preservation to think about this stuff. But for the time being, I don't think there is a safe solution. I think the only thing that, like, especially if you don't have much power in the industry, like if you're an independent game developer or you're marginalized, et cetera, the best thing that you can do is just learn how to bunker down.
Yeah.
Like, there's a reason I don't give out my location.
Oh, you're fine. And sorry about that. I ask everybody that.
No, it's totally fine.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, but, like, it's one layer of security that helps keep me, like, it doesn't keep me safe on a day-to-day basis, but I know at some point in the future it will.
Right.
If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard stories in, I don't know that we really have it so much here in the States, and obviously there's like quarantine pandemic stuff, but I have heard stories about just extreme cases in like Japan where fans will show up at like a game developer's like front door in the middle of the night, and like they're not going there to like make a threat or anything, but even just that obviously is a little bit of an overstep. I mean, I don't know if you would be like delighted to see that like a fan found out where you lived and it's just
I would be horrified.
At like 2
Get the fuck away from me. Go, get. Stay across the street.
It is a thing that happens though, which I don't think is limited to games. I think it's just humans are we're a weird bunch of critters. So okay, so there's really no good segue into this, but what's your relationship like with games media? Like do you read certain sites? Do you read none? Like what's sort of the way you overlap or intersect with them?
I like games reviews. I think that they are an important and healthy part of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. I like when they're about my games. I also kind of hate it when they're about my games because then I get massive fucking anxiety looking through like, oh my god, oh no, why did I put that in the game?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I feel like they are an important part of the ecosystem. I feel like at some point we need to have a reckoning with how, like, game sites tend to push things further in the direction of commodification of art just by the fact that, like, they, like, certain sites rank things out of 10 and, like, you can rank graphics and rank story and stuff like that. And it's just, I don't know, it feels like an unproductive way of looking at things.
Yeah.
But Yeah, I don't know. On the whole, I think that they are a healthy part of the ecosystem, and any indie game developer worth their salt knows that press is their best friend.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, does it bother you? Because sometimes I hear from developers who kind of scoff that, like, people reviewing games don't know, like, much or maybe anything about the work that's actually involved. Does that bother you? Like, when people review your stuff, does that bother you overall? Like, do you care? Is this a thing you even have an opinion about? It's just a thing I've heard for many years, or even like, well, like, like I remember like someone who worked on Silent Hill I remember someone like telling me like, well, why would such and such magazine have that person review my game? Because they usually only review sports games. Or do you not even really? I mean, I don't know if you even have an opinion there about any of that, about like who's writing about it and sort of what their point of entry or context is as far as like insider knowledge of actually creating.
Yeah, if you're gay, you can say anything you want about my games.
What's that?
If you're gay, you can say anything you want about my games.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
gotcha.
I don't know. I feel like my games primarily are made for queer people, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm trans, I'm a lesbian. These are parts of my identity, and I try to put those parts of my identity into my work.
Right.
And I feel like you can play my games if you don't have that experience, but if you do, then you kind of if you don't have that experience, then you kind of miss out on some of the subtleties. Like, the mechs and meat punks are a metaphor for alienation from your own body, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I talk about that in a very trans way, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. When it comes to like specific reviewers reviewing my things, I don't really care. I mean, they're all cool. I've never met an actively harmful reviewer, I don't think.
Yeah.
And that might just be because I'm lucky or because I haven't like stumbled into the wrong zones. But I don't know. I feel like on the whole, whenever somebody reviews my work, I tend to come out the other side with feeling good about it, feeling like I have a better understanding of what I just made, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, I think also sometimes the problem with reviews is it'll be like, I don't know, the way I describe it, it's like, all right, you're given the game before, obviously you can't do this now, you're given the game before the plane, before boarding on the plane, and then you're expected to have an opinion before takeoff. Where it'll be like, okay, you get code for the game Friday, and you need to turn in a review Sunday night.
Yeah.
Obviously, that skews like no one wants to fucking review RPGs. No one wants to do stuff that will just like a friend of mine reviewed. Like if you review like Animal Crossing or like the new Pokemon, like it's not meant to be played in the way that they're playing, and I think that can contribute to like certain jaded burnout attitude towards games and people working out their personal bullshit in games and they're taking it out on the game.
I don't know. I feel like that's not really a fault of the reviewer. Like if a reviewer is only given 2 hours to get through a 60-hour game, I don't think that's their fault. I think it's the fault of the system that put them in that place to begin with.
Well, that's
I hold no grudges against specific reviewers or against reviewers as a as a group.
Right. No, I'm not asking for that. I think it's just like I don't know. I think it's like there are certain realities of games media in games that I guess like the bigger question is like how can we just learn to live with these realities and sort of stop expecting these sites to be something that they're not capable of being. And then at the same time, like I am interested, like, yeah, I agree that like they are kind of pushing things in the direction of commodification. And then it's like, all right, well, what can they do to push in the opposite direction then? Like, I think that's a little bit more actionable than like, well, how do we just accept them for the flawed things they are?
Yeah. I mean, again, this sort of isn't really my wheelhouse just because I am not a game reviewer. I feel like my advice would primarily be useless.
Sure.
I have only published one article in a games magazine before. I can't exactly tell you what the entire system needs to be completely overhauled. Yeah.
That's okay. So, I mean, what do you feel, like, I feel like we've talked a lot about mistakes and hiccups and problems. What do you feel like right now video games are getting right?
Again, it depends on what part of the monolith we're looking at.
Well, I mean, for you, like what's out there where you're glad, like, can you name like a person or a group or a developer who's like, quote unquote, getting it right, and you feel like you're actively learning a lot just from them existing and creating? I'm not asking for like the platonic, you know, like the ultimate truest answer. Like for you, like is there a figure like that? Or I know when you're asked a question like that, it immediately goes out of your brain.
Yeah, I think they're not like specifically game developers, but like they do a ton for the game development scene. The people who work on itch.io,
sure,
I feel like they've done so much for like indie games and for like bringing them not necessarily into the mainstream, but bringing them into a specific kind of warm light. Right. Like I probably wouldn't have a career without itch.io. So yeah. My biggest props to all of them, honestly. Like the infrastructure that they put together is so incredibly helpful for like game developers, like indie game developers, really at all levels. Like you see stuff on there from like people who make a game that gets one download ever to like the creators of Night in the Woods. And like there's this vast spectrum in there and like so many different subcultures within it. And it's really nice to see all of them just sort of inhabiting the same place. And like it's a good place.
Yeah, the only negative thing I ever hear people say about itch is just how are you supposed to hear about the really cool, weird stuff? Like you almost have to have someone send you a link, or you have to just be lucky and stumble upon it. Like I have found really cool, weird stuff, but I can't remember how I found it. And invariably, it's always someone sent me a link or someone tweeted about it. I've never actually found it myself.
Yeah, I think like they are doing some good stuff with helping for discovery. Like the game tagging system is very good, and collections are very good, and bundles and jams are also both pretty good for like discovering new media. I do agree that like discovery could possibly be better, but I wouldn't know exactly how to implement that. And I feel like for its place, it's in a pretty good place. You know?
Sure. Yeah, I would agree. I'm not looking to rag on them or whatever. It's just that's literally the only criticism I've ever heard about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have another one.
No, exactly. Well, so I mean, do you feel like was there ever like a quote unquote golden age of talking about games, making games, playing games? Like, do you feel like, you know, with the age that you are and the point of entry you had, like, do you feel like you missed out on any golden age in the past of any kind?
Not really. I mean, people always talk about the indie-pocalypse, right? Like the idea that there are so many indie games these days that it's impossible to make a buck making them.
Right.
But I feel like that just shows the failure of a specific strategy that worked at another point of time. There are other strategies that are currently working pretty well, I think. And as long as you understand the state of like the indie game scene and how to interact with audiences and, you know, marketing bullshit, blah, 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 I feel like it's possible to still make a half-decent living off them. Of course, like, I'm coming at this from a privileged position. Like, even though, like, I'm incredibly queer and also mentally ill, like, I am white, I don't have any, like, debt.
Right.
I'm honestly in a very good position that, like, another person with my exact same skill set wouldn't be if they were lacking, like, some of my privileges, you know?
So do you feel like, gosh, I don't know, because I feel like questions about COVID, which we're all kind of processing, I mean, how has that impacted your ability to, I mean, I guess you said you make a living off of games. Like, how has it changed things? I hate to chart it on a better or worse binary, because I think it's also possible and true that, well, it's gotten a lot more complicated.
Yeah, it has gotten more complicated, but at the same time, it's kind of gotten more simple for me.
Okay.
I basically already worked from home.
Yeah.
Like, I would go out to a coffee shop every now and then and write, but I pretty much worked from home as a default, and now I just work from home all the time.
Did you have the experience of reading what quarantine living is and realizing that you had already been doing it? Because I had that experience.
To an extent.
I mean, not as extreme as now. There was a little bit more going outside. But, I mean, is that your sense that for many others, or some even, that this has made things actively much, much worse, trying to make an income or continue to make an income with games?
I had a period of a month, maybe a month and a half, where things were just awful for me.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like a lot of people have that adjustment period of just, what is happening? There's nothing I can do. Everything is terrible.
Right.
But I think one of the great superpowers of the human mind is we are very good at getting used to things.
Yeah.
Like, in 2 days, I will have been quarantined for 3 months. And it's not something that I really think about anymore. It's like, this is just where I work. It's where I sleep. It's where I exercise. It's
right. Yeah.
It's like a little spaceship almost.
The adaptability is something I've noticed too, where I had a email from another writer last week who she was like, "Hey, are you noticing that it's like harder to be motivated during all this?" She's like, "Well, I was working from home before all this," and I was like, "Yeah, well, we were working from home before this, but there wasn't a global pandemic happening. Like it's like we want to think it's the same, even though we know it's not." And I don't know if it's a way that it really extends to, like, I always wonder in these interviews, like, well, is it absurd to tie it back to video games? Does it always have to be tied back to video games? But I do wonder, like, I think that's a way that, like, we're pretty well adapted to in games, is just sort of, I don't know. It's sort of like we're all well aware of certain problems, and we want them to get better, but it's almost like we're continually surprised. Hey, you don't really do much about X or Y problem. It keeps coming back, which obviously we're seeing on a much broader stage and scale, just in the United States at large right now. So it's not just limited to games, but I do wonder if there's something that, like, we're able to learn about how to be better in games through this time, or I don't know. I actually don't know if I don't have. That's just a thought trailing off, because I'm obviously still trying to figure it out myself here. If that's a thing other people are trying to figure out, and so I don't want to go overly negative, but, like, we were talking about, like, all right, well, what's something that, like, that video games are getting right at the moment? Maybe we talked about this before. What do you think is, like, the biggest mistake video games have made?
Interesting question. The biggest mistake, letting me in. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, what about this? Like, for people who champion video games, on whatever huge platforms. Like what do you think they have wrong about games, or what do you feel is like a wrong message they're spreading about games?
People always talk about how video games are special, about how they are a new kind of art form, how they are revolutionizing the way that we think about ourselves, that they can give us new levels of empathy.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of that is true. I think video games are just the extension of what we've had for centuries, millennia even, which is games. Dice games, board games, card games. Like,
right.
Video games are just another way of showing those. And instead of using a deck of cards or some horse knuckles, you use like a computer, and it's just a different method of doing the same thing. Like, people who do digital art don't talk all up and down all day about how they are inventing the new medium, how they're going to give us new levels of painting.
Right.
I don't know.
I always found the empathy thing interesting, because I agree. I think it's like, well, if this is a thing that's going on, we don't have to go around continually saying it, labeling it, writing opinion pieces about it, and shrieking at other people about it on the internet. Like, if it's apparent, it's apparent.
Yeah.
I remember that really flaring up around VR, and I remember being at South by Southwest a couple of years ago. I was doing a panel and just passing by in one of the lobbies of the many buildings it takes place in, back when we could congregate in such a way. I remember hearing somebody who was like an evangelist for VR talking about all that empathy stuff, and it always struck me as weird, where it's like, so the problem, like the reason there isn't more empathy out in the world is because like our eyes aren't close enough to the screen. Like, that's kind of that's kind of ultimately what the argument boiled down to. And maybe it's different for other people, but that always struck me as a weird thing of like emotionality or whatever. Like, that's the thing that we can make more efficient. And I never understood why that got to be such a sticky thing in games. Like, I think it's a little bit of a joke now, but for a long time it wasn't.
Yeah. I don't know. My quarrel with empathy games is, I think the ethos behind them is you got to walk a mile in somebody's shoes, right?
That's what they say.
But you're not walking a mile in somebody's shoes.
No.
You're sitting in somebody's shoes almost. I don't know, the thing that really bugs me about empathy games, and I feel like this is something that's intrinsic to the nature of games that can't really be gotten around, is you can always stop playing a video game. You can always walk away. You can always say, I don't want to do this anymore, and leave. You don't get to leave an identity. You don't get to leave the experience of being marginalized. You don't get to stop playing. And as long as you have that option to stop playing, it's not going to be faithful.
Right.
Like, it's not something that, like, you experience one shitty thing and then you understand what it means to be marginalized. Like, marginalization is this constant thing that you experience over years. It's something that builds up. It's a kind of frustration that occurs over time.
Yeah.
And you can't get that in a 20-minute experience.
Yeah, that's true. It's hard to convey accumulation. It's this. Yeah, that's the thing too with like, people like, as far as like quarantine or whatever. I mean, I know you're talking about something else, but it's like we kind of forget that our life experience is cumulative. It's not like, oh, now we're just working from home and we're starting over. It's like, oh, we're dealing with all the weirdness of working from home. And also, like, wondering when we can go to the next chapter of this thing and hoping we don't die and hope people we care about don't die. It's obviously...
The next podcast name drop.
Yeah, it's drastically different. So I have just a couple more questions for you here. I know, like, and as it does draw to a close, the questions do get a little bigger and harder to answer. Mm-hmm. It's okay if you just want to offer a joke answer, if that's like the most that maybe you think you can do, if you don't really know how to respond. But so, like, who do you feel is the most invisible? I hate the word consumer, but consumer of games. Like who is a part of the audience out there that people kind of forget is out there?
Older women.
I feel like it's been that way for a long time. Like, I remember when I don't really review games anymore or write criticism, but I remember, like, I would review for places that I think thought I wanted to do it as a joke, like hidden object games, which that's sort of the prevailing wisdom that it self-selects into that demographic.
You know how many moms play Bejeweled?
I'm gonna say maybe all of them, or maybe or at least maybe many of them.
Yeah.
I know my mom does. So why do you think that is? I mean, I feel like we say that and it's like, oh yes, of course, but like, what are the reasons for that not really being embraced as like a legitimate part of, as a legitimate part of this?
I mean, it just comes down to who the games industry takes seriously.
Right.
Like, we don't take older people seriously. We don't take women seriously. We don't take people of color seriously, but that's not something that I'm super qualified to talk about.
Right.
And yeah, I feel like there are all these people who love video games and who, like, play things regularly that are just never targeted. And, like, maybe it's nice. Maybe it's nice to not be in the spotlight like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not really a consumer these days, so.
No, I don't even like that word. I wish there was a better word. I'll find it someday. So, let me see. So you, this is another kind of word that I know kind of rankles people. You called the discourse to borrow your words, a nightmare zone around games. And you said you try to stay away from it as much as possible. I'm just going to read this part back to you. You said it's all stuck one way or another. Every day someone comes along and invents a new problem, and then it's the topic of the day. It's a mess, and it's unproductive. Today, whatever the day was you emailed us, we're apparently all fighting over the definition of quote-unquote solo dev. Who does this matter to? What does this affect? The current system is almost built to drive these unproductive arguments. So I often wonder, I mean, do you have a feeling that, like, is there a silent majority here that feels this way? Like, I feel like I only ever hear the word discourse used derisively, dismissively, sarcastically. But then I see other people who are locked in it, love to rankle other people, and I don't know if they think of it as a thing that's productive, but rather this is a thing to win and bludgeon other people with. But I wonder, like, Twitter is not like a stand-in for the whole world. Like, do you feel like, are we in a silent majority here or a silent minority here who, I feel like Nightmare Zone, maybe you're being too nice saying that.
Yeah. I feel like, I don't know. The thing about discourse is that it doesn't matter until it does, you know? Like, it doesn't hurt you. It's completely irrelevant until somebody says something that targets you. And then you got to throw your hat in the ring. And I feel like that's how these discussions often work. Like, so many people decide, like, okay, I am above all this. I am above the discourse. And then somebody says something like, for example, if we're talking about me, somebody says, like, oh, yeah, Met games, those are overplayed. And now I got to throw my hat in the ring. because I got to defend my honor.
Mm-hmm.
And like
you've been challenged to a duel.
Exactly. And social media, it encourages these hot takes because hot takes get attention because people find their honor is disturbed, and then they have to quote tweet, and then they have to comment on it, and now everybody's looking at this one article. It's the controversy, the controversy machine. Mm-hmm. I can't talk today. And I think the only way to really stop it is to do a radical reimagining of what social media is. Yeah, I don't know.
No, you're good. I'm with you. So, okay, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you're doing on time because I got just 2 more here, but I also don't want to keep you. Do you have time?
Yeah, I can keep going for another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, that should be good then. So I think I wonder too, because I talk a lot to, game developers, I talk to game critics, I talk to people in other disciplines about, parallel topics or spaces where they've kind of dealt more head on with the kind of problems we've been discussing, or it's further in the rear view, this kind of stuff being such a deep wound. And I often talk to just sort of people who play games, people who don't really have their career in any way staked in it. And I feel like, you were talking about that whole 80s, 90s period. And often the prevailing way people would think about trying to influence the direction that things are going is this old line of, quote unquote, I'll vote with my wallet. I don't know if you've heard that line or if people still say that, but I feel like I often talk to just regular players, regular people, and they don't really know how they can help push things in a more positive direction. I don't know if you have a sense of that or a recommendation of that. I think there was a whole thing you wrote about with the cyberpunk genre and sort of how defeatist it is and how people can sort of forget that, if they're being depicted as a swarm of bugs, under someone's feet, that bugs can still be pretty terrifying if they're unified towards a singular goal. But I don't really know what to prescribe. Not that I'm comparing, regular folks to bugs, but I never know what to prescribe or tell them what to do, because I think that's still the attitude they fall back on is, well, I'll just vote with my wallet. Is there a better way they can swarm to help advocate for positive change in some of the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a super interesting question.
Yeah.
What the fuck was I on with that bug metaphor? What was I saying? That's the second worst metaphor I've ever used.
You said the world is terrible because of these. I think it was that same interview, actually. No, yeah. I think you actually didn't write it in an email to me. Sorry. You said the world is terrible because of these massive corporations and that we can survive, but trying to fight is pointless because we're like bugs under their feet, ... They forget how terrifying a swarm of bugs can be if they're unified towards a singular goal.
You know what? Hell yeah, I agree with myself. That fucking rules. Good job, past me. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to communal action. When one person does something, it's one person. When 10 people do something, that's 10 people. If 100 people do something, that's 100 people. And I know I'm just counting right now, but I don't know. There is something important in that idea, right? You can multiply your force by doing actions with other people. And maybe that's voting with your wallet. Maybe it's spreading the word about a new thing that you find positive. Maybe it's denouncing something that you find negative. I feel like at the end of the day, you do have to sort of question the morality of everything that you do involving capitalism.
Right.
And obviously we can't turn down, like, we can't destroy the system by buying things within it. Like, the master's tools will never destroy the master's house and all that.
Right.
But within this system, within this crappy system that we've got, I think it is still worth trying to figure out the ways to act righteously while also simultaneously trying to figure out how to tear it down from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference. I mean, I know you said you were just counting numbers, but it's like, the way I think of it is like, it's the difference between like a single instrument playing versus an orchestra, in terms of not just volume and force, but also just like the act of a large group of people together, working together towards a common goal. Like there's no such thing as like an improvised orchestra, right? Like people all come together and they know what they're going to do and they do it together.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, okay, this will be my last question for you. What do you feel video games have accomplished?
I have no idea. It's difficult to imagine a world without video games. But if we try, we can make it happen. With your support today,
call now.
We can end all video games.
we have these lovely tote bags.
Yeah.
Call now.
Yeah, we turn the video games directly into tote bags. It's a very difficult process. It costs a lot of money, but it does decrease the amount of video games in the world.
But
you can get the last copy of Mario,
right,
which, by the way, is monarchist propaganda. I brought it back.
Yeah, I mean, the downside is fewer games. The plus side is more bags. So, I mean, if you look at that math, just look at the savings, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I'm going to give you a twist.
All right.
The upside is fewer games. The downside is more bags.
Oh, man. What am I gonna put in them?
Exactly. I have like an entire drawer in my apartment that's just full of bags. What am I going to do with them? There's too many already.
Well, you mentioned you got a kitten, and
yeah,
what my cat likes to do, they're like little fabric caves to a cat. I noticed this years ago when like I had a tote bag from some store, and it's like, where's the cat? Where's the cat? And yeah, she, it's like a little blanket that she can go in and hide in, and it conforms to her. And now she just has a mound of tote bags from like different conferences and stuff that I've been to, and that's like, that's like her. It's like one of her many beds. Although everywhere she goes, she's able to just take a nap. And I'll tell you that she can't do that with video games.
Yeah, exactly. Cats can't enjoy video games. That's what's wrong with them. They need to make a video game for cats. Then I will say that games have accomplished something.